Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to here for Let's Talk. Today we have with us Tzvika Shahaf, Senior Director of Product Management at Perforce. Tzvika, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. How are you, Swapnil?
I am great. Thanks for asking and thanks for joining me today. Of course, we are going to talk about the latest 2024 State of Open Source report. But before we talk about the report, quickly remind our viewers, what is Perforce all about?
So we at Perforce, we power innovation, for DevOps company. We do that, in four major areas of our business, from developer productivity and developer tools to different testing areas, infrastructure and IT operations, and expanding that also with our recent acquisition to data management, products. So it's all about the power of innovation for DevOps companies.
Now let's talk about this report. Before we talk about findings, for how long you folks have been doing this report, and what is the idea behind this report?
This is a great question. Again, we at Perforce, as part of our DevTools, efforts, we're focusing on open source management and open source technologies. And, we've been monitoring, enterprise needs and requirements when it comes to open source. What are the leading, I would say, motivations for organization to use open source components? What are the biggest challenges? And where do we see areas of opportunities? So for the past couple of years, we've been publishing this State of Open Source report, and we share it publicly, with the market, just to ensure that, executives and practitioners have good grasp of, the leading trends and the changes that we see in the market around it.
And how important is open source for Perforce? What is your open source story there?
Open source adoption is growing. It's steadily, upgrow kind of trend that we see, or steady upward trend that we see in the market. A lot of the products and solutions that we, maintain internally and provide to our customers are relying significantly on open source. It requires, proper compliance. It requires security and different policies. It requires maintenance. Sometimes some open source components are getting off the main kind of stream and requires end of life support, patches, many other aspects of it. So we're trying to look holistically at open source management, with hundreds of packages that we maintain, to ensure that anyone that uses, open source product can do that with greater confidence.
Now let's talk about some of the findings of this report. Now, when I talk about findings, since you folks, have been doing it for a bit, I also want to look at two things. One is that some of the trends that you see, you expect them and you're like, hey, this is the natural progression. These trends which kind of reinforce our view on the state of open source. And then there can be something, even for someone like you, they're like shocking that you were not expecting them. Now those could be positive, those could be negative. So I want to look at both aspects of some of the findings here.
Yeah, but makes perfect sense. Thank you, Swapnil, for this question. The part that doesn't surprise us is that, open source adoption among organizations continue to experience, greater adoption. The leading factor for that, that we see, with the data that is coming from 2023 and beginning of 2024 is the cost reduction as the top reason for open source, adoption. 2023 for many organizations was the year of efficiency, and as such, open source became more legitimate solution, to replace other commercial offerings. But, together with that, I think that the surprising or the interesting part is what are the top three open source technologies that we see, being adopted that the organization are kind of prioritizing investment in. Those would be data technologies, cloud native software, and container orchestration. More projects, more budget and resources are being kind of diverted into these spaces, and accordingly, more requirements around open source skills and open source management, functionality for these tools, are being, heard in the industry. I think the other side and the other interesting, keep in mind kind of thing is that supporting open source become more complex because we see more need for security policies, for compliance, especially if you are an enterprise and you say, you know what, Swapnil, I'm open, to adopt new technologies that are not commercially supported, but I still need to follow certain standards that my organization expect to have, or that I've been using open source technology for quite some time, and suddenly some of these are no longer supported in the mainstream and require end of life maintenance, patching, security fixes, and other things. So those remain kind of top of mind challenges that we hear more interest from enterprises into how can we address some of these challenges.
And when we look at some of the challenges, I mean, open source has been around for, I mean, I've been covering open source ever since I finished my journalism. And then back in those days, we used to tell people why you should do open source, what are the benefits of doing open source. And it was also more or less like, if you do open source, you should also, if possible, get it. We cannot expect every company to dedicate resources. Some companies don't have resources, It's okay to be a consumer of open source, but it's also good to be, we used to use the term good open source citizen. Now, fast forward 2024, today almost everybody is using open source, whether you pick Microsoft or Apple, to well-known proprietary companies. But a lot of their services are powered by open source. They are big open source contributors as well. Those may be exceptions, but there are a lot of other folks, they consume open source, they use open source, but they don't know how to get involved with open source. We're also seeing some trends where companies are changing their licenses. What are your thoughts on these kind of trends where companies are using open source, but they really don't know how to get engaged, how to get involved? So it's kind of solved, but new set of, it's like fashion, it keep coming back. So what do you think about these developments?
I couldn't agree more with that kind of ambivalent approach into open source that we kind of hear or pick in the marketplace around that. Close to 40% of large enterprises increased their use significantly in open source in the past year. And I would say, out of the kind of report, another interesting fact is that 95% of the organization that we've surveyed, admitted that they either maintain or increased their usage. So even if organizations were used to manage a certain amount of packages in their open source stack, that has kept growing, and they prefer to use proven technologies that are backed by the support of the community rather than trying to develop that support on their own. In some cases, as I've mentioned, and I think one of the biggest gaps that we identify is that some knowledge has been lost over the years from different reasons. People have retired, people, have moved to other roles, team reduction that happened during the past couple of years with financial downturns led to some of these challenges, but you still need to support the long tail of technologies that you have, across the org. Now, the move to cloud native, for mid-size and small organization, and the adoption of different database technologies, with the increased use of AI, of machine learning, and data technologies is also driving greater investment in open source that requires, different skill set that maybe the organizations don't have. So the tension between these two, I agree with you, Swapnil. Open source has been with us for quite some time, but there is a new wave of technologies and adoption of open source packages that leads into that influx in interest and the need to support open source in the org. So we see, among some of the most business critical tools that we hear, from the standard Linux that we always see in, and Eclipse and Python, even PHP, is part of the most used one according to our, survey. and Apache, but you also see Kafka and Kubernetes and Docker and other new technologies, Jakarta and MySQL that are becoming really top of mind for organizations. Many admit that sometimes they just don't have the skills in-house, or that they need some support or good advice into how to handle those.
While you were mentioning some of the names of those projects, in this report, did you also see, because the way we consume, the way we run, deploy, write applications has changed? We talk a lot about cloud native. What kind of open source projects or application you are saying there's uptick? I mean, there are certain ones which are like concrete, which are foundational, like kernel, Kubernetes. But beyond that, what are the projects or applications you are saying? Hey, we are seeing a lot of a spike in demand versus these are the ones that we are seeing some decline.
I would say that again, with the adoption of different, modern technologies around AI and, around data management, there is an uptick in cloud native, around Docker, Kubernetes, Prometheus, and OpenStack that are, there. Even, things like Podman or Eclipse are still, or Rancher are still mentioned as high. The biggest increase that we've seen, from last year to this year, was around Kubernetes, like with close to 10% increase in overall usage from last year, and that adoption of cloud native, even among enterprise customers, is something that we see growing. You can say that even in Europe, close to 43% of growth in the use of Kubernetes. In North America, it's like close to 37%. So the overall industry trend, of open source is there. On some of the frameworks, if we talk about React or jQuery, Angular 2 and .NET, you would see some of these as the more kind of common and used one, and interesting to see that usage around Spring is dropping close to 10%. Very fascinating, fact, despite the growing adoption of Java. But yes, some kind of anecdotes to call out and mention.
Can you also talk about, this may or may not be part of this report survey, but you interact with players a lot. Even in this cloud-centric, cloud native world where you don't have to worry about anything, everything is running in your cloud. What are the reasons why organizations still choosing open source? What are the main drivers there, reasons?
So first, I think it's important to say, in the background of this discussion, security becomes top of mind for everyone, and the ability to know what is the software bill of materials that your organization is running is becoming common, and something that is not relevant anymore just for governmental entities or those that are being regulated. CISOs are looking to understand what kind of packages, open source packages, are running within their organization, and ensuring that they keep track and that they keep their software up to date and not exposing any potential vulnerability around these. To your question, Swapnil, around why organizations are using open source, again, based on our findings from our state of open source report, the first and leading factor for that is the cost, is the need to reduce cost. And as I've mentioned, 2023 was kind of a pivotal year in that sense, when organizations are trying to narrow their spend on specific components, and open source is a good alternative for those. Another part is, that organizations are trying to improve their velocity. They're trying to shorten their time to market and use innovative components, and open source is providing a breadth of great solutions that are out there, supported by the community, and the stability of a solution that is supported by a wide community of users that keep contributing to that is also key for that. Vendor lock-in is yet another reason where organizations are trying to reduce dependency on commercial software, and in some cases the influx in license cost year over year that they see. And lastly, I think, important to note, if you're running on some legacy stacks and you're looking to modernize your software, open source can be a great alternative for some of the things that you're looking to achieve on that front, using open standards and interoperability, of course, as part of that.
And as we talk about, the reasons why organizations choose open source, you did touch on that briefly earlier, but I want to go a bit detail is that what kind of challenges, what kind of pain points they feel when it comes to embracing open source. Is it about technology? Is it about vendor ecosystem? Because open source can very easily solve day one problem, but day two is where the challenges start. You need functionality, you need features, you need maintenance of that project. Not every company is massive with the big pool of, and then there's so many open source. I mean, there's so much, you need talent for all those technologies. So what are some of the pain points?
Yeah, so sometimes we look at it and we use the analogy of a baseball, when you have all these stitches between the pieces of the ball, and open source requires these days, and we see more and more organizations that are establishing, the office of, open source kind of program, or OSPO as they are called, trying to strategize the use of open source across the entire SDLC, for organizations. When you are stitching pieces and trying, in some cases to patch certain components rather than looking holistically at open source, at some point you would hit those roadblocks that you were referring to, Neil. So I think that the challenge here is to come up with an open source strategy and the decision of which components you're using in which part of your, software development lifecycle to ensure that, kind of broader vision and to avoid any potential blocks down the road. When you pick a solution, usually you don't pick it for today, you pick it for tomorrow, and you want to ensure, sustainability, of that open source component that you're using, and that includes also the understanding whether at a certain point of time that open source package that you're using will get into end of life mode, and what is your plan beyond that. The second part, and again, mentioning it one more time, but it's important to say, security of open source component is top of mind for organizations today and can serve a fertile soil for multiple vulnerabilities if you're not addressing that properly. We at Perforce not look only just on the open source management, we're also looking at the infrastructure management capacity. And, I had the pleasure of working in one of those products where, you would see large organizations with hundreds of thousands of nodes in their estate. And at any point in time, you want to make sure, if you are a large bank or a large insurance company or working in another regulated space, that your nodes, your machines there are patched properly and you're not exposing yourself to the next Log4j or any other vulnerability that may jeopardize your users. As part of the recent White House statement about the software bill of materials, the biggest change that, the White House is addressing as part of the cybersecurity strategy is that from now on, the stewards of the data will be held accountable, and not just, whoever is hosting that. In simple words, if you're running in one of the public clouds and there is a certain security vulnerability there, as the app owner, you cannot put the blame on AWS or Azure or anyone else. You are the owner of the app. You need to make sure that everything is patched and secured, and that data is not exposed in any sort of way, and you're following certain compliance standards. Open source falls under the same kind of box as well. But in other cases, if it's not supported anymore or don't have a commercial support, that's where enterprise kind of struggle these days.
Anything else that you feel that, hey, Swapnil, we should have talked about that? I mean, open source is close to my heart. I can sit and talk all day. But anything else that you feel like they should be critical, or you think that we covered some key points of this report?
No, I think that, the main kind of food for thought that, we're trying to bring to the industry with this report and with other activities that we do, is to take like three main elements when you consider your open source strategy and your open source growth. You want to make sure that you have the right experience and proficiency within your organization when you make those decisions about specific tools and specific stacks, open source stacks that you're looking to adopt. The second part is that that solution should be cost effective. You should be able to reduce cost on certain commercial packages that you're using, but you don't want to expose yourself to new, cost structures that you were not being aware before. So again, as I've mentioned, when you pick a tool, you want to make sure that it's not only for today, but also for tomorrow, and that the things that you don't treat doesn't treat you at a certain point. And the third part to keep in mind is really the open source security, making sure that you're putting the bets on the right tools that do not expose any vulnerability, that are well patched, and align with your broader security posture and security philosophy in your organization. So really kind of three areas to keep in mind when you're considering open source, when you're looking at certain components and trying, to fit the broader strategy to that.
Tzvika, thank you so much for taking time out today. Talk about this report. Talk about the whole, how the open source ecosystem is evolving. Thanks for great insights, and I look forward to chat with you folks again. Thank you.
Thank you, Swapnil. Pleasure was all mine, and look forward to our next one.